Hello, my name is Dr. Jamie Pearson, and I am an assistant professor of special education at North Carolina State University. I conduct research around supporting Black families and autistic youth in terms of getting access to services and support. I've worked in both home and school-based settings for about 12 years now, providing direct supports, coaching, and advocacy supports for families, particularly those who come from underserved backgrounds. So I'm really excited to talk to you all today about disparities in diagnoses and service access for Black autistic youth and their families. So our objectives for today, I want to describe the disparities that we see in autism diagnoses and access to services that exist among Black autistic youth. And then we'll talk some about the historic and systemic barriers that maintain these disparities. And then finally, we'll talk through some both short-term and long-term implications of these disparities on Black autistic youth and their families. And before we jump in, just to give a bit of a note on language and neurodiversity, I was trained in special education where, of course, we learned to use person-first language, so people with autism. However, in respect for individuals who identify with identity first language, I will also use interchangeably identity first language or autistic people. So I think it's really important that we think about the neurodiversity movement and what that means in terms of autism and supporting autistic youth, autistic adults, et cetera. And so I just like to put a little note in there at the beginning that I will use both people with autism and autistic people interchangeably throughout this presentation. So I mentioned at the beginning in my little intro that a lot of my work is really around supporting families, right? So families provide a great deal of support for individuals broadly, but specifically for students with disabilities and even more specifically among autistic youth. And then there are even more sort of specific pieces and nuanced experiences around cultural minority families. And so we'll talk a bit about that. But I really like to situate this talk in terms of thinking about the roles of families. What are families and how do they play roles in addressing these disparities and really what these experiences are like for Black autistic youth in particular. So defining the family, we think about family as a variety of structures that includes members who regard themselves as a unit, right? And so I think traditionally here in the United States in particular, we've always thought about this sort of traditional nuclear family unit. And obviously we have really expanded our definitions of families in terms of gender norms, in terms of genders broadly, in terms of what that family unit might look like and how it's comprised. And so these relationships might be biological, they could be based on your marriage or partnership status, living arrangement status, or just one's own understanding or definition of family, right? So how people construct family has different meaning for everyone, and it varies across cultures and across backgrounds. Caregivers. So I'll talk about parents and caregivers sort of interchangeably as well. And for this presentation, we're thinking about a caregiver as the person who provides primary care for the child, for the student, for the individual. And so this could be mothers, it could be fathers, foster parents, legal guardians, grandparents, anyone really who serves in the primary care role, and sometimes a supporting care role for the child with autism or child with disabilities. And again, this is particularly important when we think about historically marginalized families and how we construct the family unit, what that means, and who engages as a caregiver, who engages in the roles of caregiving can vary across cultural minorities. And so it's really critical that we keep these definitions in mind as we think about how we're supporting families overall. So families with children participating in special ed or who are receiving special ed services or who identify as autistic, these family members play multiple roles and serve multiple roles beyond just caregiving, right? So in many ways, they serve as an information seeker. They're trying to help to build a knowledge base for themselves in learning better how to support their child or their family member. They engage as problem solvers, right? So what steps do I need to take to address the challenges, the barriers, the problems that we're facing as a family? Oftentimes, family members serve in the role of a committee member. So they're part of IEP teams, right? And thinking about, how do I contribute? What are my views, perceptions, experiences, and what do they mean with regard to implementation of goals, and et cetera. Sometimes parents and family members are public educators, or community advocates is another term that I use for that. They go out into the community, and they teach others about what their child's needs are and how they can support them. And then we have more political activists or disability advocates who engage actively in really shaping what experiences are like in terms of supporting the needs of autistic youth and their families. So thinking about that from an advocacy perspective and really activating their agency and their voice. And then finally, a spokesperson. We have many parents who identify as a spokesperson for their autistic children and family members, particularly for those who may be nonverbal. And so families really sort of identify with that role of a spokesperson. And so these are, again, just it kind of helps to set the tone, because we're going to be talking a lot about families as we go throughout this presentation. And so I like to start by just thinking through some of those definitions and what those mean with regard to the family unit and how we support autistic youth. So next, we're going to think about autism and intersectionality. Intersectionality is when students experience the multidimensionality of a disability and at least one other social identity. So this might include their race, in addition to disability, their gender, in addition to the disability, and or their sexuality, as some examples. And so this multidimensionality is referred to as intersectionality. And so an example of this might be when we think about an autistic student who identifies as Black and Christian, for example, right? So we have their identity in terms of their disability status, their racial and ethnic backgrounds, and their religious affiliation or faith identification, right? And so that's another example of a social identity with which many people identify that shapes who they are in terms of the multidimensionality of our experiences. So for me, for example, I identify as a Black heterosexual woman, right? And each of those identities have implications for how I engage with the communities that I serve, with the students that I teach, with the parents that I represent in advocacy work, et cetera. And so it's important as we go throughout this as well to think about why are we talking specifically about Black autistic youth, right? Why are we talking specifically about the experiences of Black autistic boys? What are the implications of those intersecting identities? And what does that mean for their experiences, for their outcomes, for their families' experiences? So to improve the outcomes of students who receive special education services and those who identify as autistic, educators are sort of tasked with adopting practices to actively move to understand how these social constructs intersect with and shape the lived experiences of their students and their families to deepen their understanding of oppression. And so again, here you see examples of these intersecting identities, right? So ethnicity, gender, age, religion, class, culture, disability, sexuality. It's important for us to think about how these constructs intersect, and again, what the implications of those are for students' access to services, students' identification in terms of autism identification, if they're able to maintain and sustain access to ongoing supports, whether or not their families have partnerships that are effective with service providers, educators and healthcare providers, et cetera. So this intersectionality really does sit at the center of thinking about the needs of historically marginalized families and how we have multiple identities that shape our needs and our experiences. So I've been talking for a few minutes, so let's just take a quick break here, and we're going to do a Google image search. And so feel free to use these example keywords or choose some other keywords of your choice, but using whatever device you have available, you can search toddlers with autism, autistic children, autistic adults, women with autism, whatever you like. You could use person first language or identity first language. And then let's see what you come up with. So again, that's going to be a Google image search with keywords listed here. And then very likely, you probably saw some of these same images or very similar images, right? You know, we're judging these at face value. I'm just sort of doing a visual observation here. But for the most part, you know, these photos are fairly representative of, many of them are young white boys, so especially the first two on top. And then we have women at the bottom, and that search was specifically for autistic women. And overall, we see very little representation in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, right? And so this has been part of what has driven a lot of the work that I do with regard to supporting Black families, because there is not only lack of representation of racial and ethnic minority families in literature, in marketing. When we think about some of the bigger autism organizations, oftentimes those resources, that literature, the marketing is devoid of Black and brown faces. And although it seems like, well, maybe that's not such a big deal, it really does have implications for how Black and brown families are able to relate to the experiences that autistic youth have, and what their families might experience, and what does this mean for my family, right? And so this is an activity that I do pretty often. Actually, I like to do it in presentations, and even when I'm teaching my students, because it helps us to really sit with this and think about, hey, there really are you know, implications related to these racial disparities. And at the face of that is the fact that we don't see Black and brown faces. And so we'll talk more about what that means in terms of research in our next webinar. But in this one, we're really thinking about what are these disparities. And so we'll go into thinking through and talking through disparities among historically marginalized autistic youth and their family. So I'll start here with a little vignette about Keisha. So when teachers mentioned that Keisha's son might need an initial evaluation to see if he met the criteria for special education services, his mother was crushed. She saw behavioral differences in her son and knew he needed support, but didn't know exactly what support. Keisha thought that eventually her son would grow out of the behavioral differences and that this would be a temporary phase he was going through. When educators mentioned autism, Keisha struggled with accepting this educational label because she remembered how hurtful it was seeing her older cousin labeled and then taught in separate settings growing up. So we'll revisit this vignette as we go throughout the presentation, but this really sets the stage and sets the tone for the experiences of many Black families who have little familiarity with autism, but who have great familiarity with family members who either were identified as having intellectual disability or behavioral disorders, and who were taught in separate or segregated settings. And so many families, parents, Black parents in particular, can relate to the challenges that those separate or segregated settings or those experiences in general had, what those experiences were for them. And so they're often reluctant to sort of go down that same road. And so we'll talk about how those disparities persist and what that means for the experiences of Black autistic youth. So historically, children and families from marginalized communities have faced challenges that are rooted in systemic inequality in US schools, right? When we think about Brown versus Board, for example, it seems like oh, well, that was quite a while ago, but also hasn't been really that long, right? And so Brown versus Board not only set the tone for racial equality in terms of access to schooling, right? Desegregated schooling, but also helped to set the tone in terms of inclusive schooling for students with disabilities. And so many families have navigated historically and systemically, they've navigated challenges related to access to equal schooling practices. And it's definitely played a role in how families continue to engage in the education system today. So historically marginalized children with autism, particularly those who are Black and Latino, tend to experience less adequate services. In some cases, they have lower quality curriculum and instruction. We see very much more often that Black and Latino children are segregated from their non-disabled peers, or they're served in self-contained classrooms. And then there's disproportionate representation in special education. So the percentage of students, of Black students, for example, who are in public schools in the United States does not match the percentage of Black students who are in special education in public schools in the United States. We see an overrepresentation of Black children in special education, in addition to an overrepresentation of students who speak English as a second language. And so there are particular disparities related to, outcomes based on how we're serving students, where we're serving students, and the quality of the pedagogy and instruction that is available for those students. So more specifically, when we think about autism diagnoses, what are these disparities, right? What are the challenges? What are the differences? Well, we know that white children are about 30% more likely to be diagnosed with autism than Black and Latino children or individuals. And then we also see differences in terms of geography. So I am here in North Carolina, and so I shared a map. We have 100 counties in North Carolina. I'm in central North Carolina where it's fairly urban, but we have several areas that are very rural, right? And so in these types of situations, we see that urban areas report diagnosis rates that are more than 2.5 times greater than those in rural areas, excuse me. And so there are definite disparities in related to geography. As an additional note, particularly here in North Carolina, there is some correlation between race and ethnicity in urban context or rural context. So for example, here in northeastern North Carolina, we have some very rural, but also high populations of Black families. And then in the western part of the state, we have very rural, high population of Native American families. And so it varies throughout. Like there are also rural counties that are primarily white families. And so we not only see, again, that those experiences around geography and what those disparities might be, but also the added disparate experiences of those families of color or Black or Latino youth. And then finally, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this, we see autism diagnosed and occur. We see the prevalence much higher in boys. So males are 4 times more likely than females to be diagnosed with autism. And we are learning a bit more about how females are engaging in masking or adapting what might be perceived as socially acceptable behaviors in spaces to be able to engage in more inclusivity, right? So females have developed this strategy and these skills to be able to adapt to what has historically been deemed sort of normal socialization. And so we think, researchers think that might be playing a role in some of what we're seeing in terms of the differences in prevalence, but we also know that there are genetic factors that play a role in the higher identification of autism in males specifically. So these are some of the broad disparities that we see with regard to autism diagnoses. More specifically, when we think about the racial and ethnic disparities, there's a particular mental health disparities among minority families, and there's often a mistrust of the system due to years of institutionalized discrimination. And so for many parents, they have concerns. They may not raise the issue with health professionals based on the fear of the potential consequences their child will suffer if he or she is perceived as disabled or as having a mental health condition. And so in my experiences, both in terms of community-based, community-engaged supports, but also with research, Black families in particular face a lot of stigma around what does it mean to have an autistic youth, right? What does it mean to have this disability, this label? What are the implications of that moving forward? And so those experiences are often challenging for families to work through because of the stigma that's associated with that. In addition, despite the higher threshold that historically marginalized parents have for expressing their concerns to pediatricians, medical experts may be more hesitant to respond to the concerns of minority parents, and they tend to instead see behavior problems rather than a child with disability. And so there have been a few research studies that have really highlighted this very clearly in terms of the implicit and explicit biases that healthcare providers often have in terms of how they interpret disability, right? What does this behavior mean for this child, right? And so there's one particular study that I always use as an example where there were two children, one Black boy and one white boy, who presented the same behavioral profiles, right? And one was diagnosed with autism and one was diagnosed with a behavioral disorder. The Black boy was diagnosed with behavioral disorder and the white boy was diagnosed with autism. And that's, we tend to see that quite a bit in terms of these disparities because there are biases that are attached to how we interpret challenging behavior or maladaptive behavior in Black boys. And so we really have to think about what have been our experiences, what are our biases, what are our backgrounds, and how does that play a role in our interpretation of the needs of students? How does that play a role in our assessment of autistic students or those who may be identified as autistic? And so it's really critical to think about these racial and ethnic disparities. And then finally, socioeconomic status is often linked to race and ethnicity. And so this article, there's a quote, they say, it often takes multiple appointments to get a diagnosis, which is a problem in families where parents are paid hourly or they only have a single car and also have to arrange childcare for other siblings. Each additional step it takes for an assessment means that more people fall through the cracks. And this is literally what we see every day in our work in terms of families who are trying to navigate the system. They're trying to figure out what is my first step, right? How do I get my child identified? How do I manage working, right? How do I manage not going to work and being able to pay my bills? And so there are, circumstances beyond the immediate needs of an autistic youth that many families struggle with, particularly those who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. The caveat that I'll add here, however, is that socioeconomic status does not always mediate the experiences of Black families and outcomes for autistic youth. In other words, Black families who don't come from poverty or who have higher socioeconomic statuses still experience many of the disparities that we've been discussing. And so again, the financial resources are not enough to sort of get rid of some of those challenges that they face with regard to racial and ethnic disparities as Black families. So here are a few other sort of overviews of these disparities. We've talked about most of these, but I'll just highlight here again that Black children comprise about 15% of the general population in US public schools, but more than 20% of the special ed population. And then Black children are the most overrepresented in nearly every special education category, with the exception of autism. So Black kids still are falling a little bit under the curve with regard to autism diagnoses or autism identification in US public schools. And barriers to advocacy are often exacerbated among Latino families versus white families because sometimes special ed documents are only offered in English, or the interpretation at school meetings is inaccurate. And so again, this creates another disparity that we see among Latino families. And some of these disparities related to access to services are due to the language barriers, the cultural divergence or mismatch between families and educators and systems that support them, and then the delayed diagnoses that we see among Latino autistic youth. So then, what are the impact or the effects of this disproportionality, right? Oftentimes, students are mislabeled, as we mentioned earlier. Some students might be identified with a behavioral disorder. Sometimes students just generally fail to receive the appropriate services, right? They aren't getting the needed services. In some cases, the resources are misdirected, or students may be more prone to academic failure or more behavioral problems as an impact of this disproportionality. And then finally, we see increases in segregated settings, or self-contained settings for students who have been identified as autistic and who also come from a historically marginalized population. And so these are some of the impacts of that disproportionality. So when we think about this, right, so we've talked a lot so far about, what it means to be a family, who comprises a family, but also what are the disparities and disparate experiences of Black autistic youth and Latino autistic youth in particular. And now we're thinking about what does this mean in terms of the bigger picture? And so I gathered a few examples just to kind of bring this home a little bit, right? We see disparity headlines in the news around autism relatively often, and most of these are headlines from the past couple of years. Diagnosis timeline drags for Black autistic children. For Black kids, autism caught late in the game. Raising BIPOC children with autism, parents struggle to find support. Family navigation helps reduce disparities in autism diagnosis. And so these are just some examples of disparity headlines that we see relatively often with regard to supporting the needs of historically marginalized children, autistic children and their families. And so it's important to think about, what are the implications of these disparities? So they lead to barriers, generally. Power blocks can heighten perceptions of powerlessness and are potential barriers to families getting the services that they need in order to reach their full potential or their child's full potential. And so this might be in the form of family, racial, cultural, and linguistic differences. These barriers might be in the form of discrimination, stigma, lack or poor communication between educators and families or service providers and families. These barriers may come in the form of limited access to services or limited knowledge, right? So just not knowing what to do next or not knowing how to implement particular parent implemented strategies that may be efficacious for the child. And so these are power blocks or barriers that families face along the way as a result of the disparities that we just discussed. And then there are also barriers that affect family empowerment, right? So empowerment is this sense of agency and having the knowledge and just kind of that overall power essentially to be able to engage in the work that you need to support your child or your loved one or your family member. However, due to racial, cultural, and linguistic differences between school and home settings, some caregivers or parents or family members, they often feel disconnected from schools, and this may result in estrangement, alienation, or discrimination when interacting with educators and when attempting to access services. And so this has a role or plays a role in family empowerment. Because when caregivers feel discriminated against or marginalized, they often feel powerless and they feel challenged and they struggle to feel empowered and struggle with being able to advocate successfully for autistic youth. Additional barriers are around the low perceptions of empowerment. So sometimes Black parents in particular don't perceive themselves to have the agency, have the knowledge, have the resources to be able to support their child's needs. And so these low perceptions, right, the perceived levels of empowerment can lead to feelings of self-blame, of hopelessness, and those types of feelings further inhibit parents and family members from taking action, right? So it creates sort of another barrier in and of itself, right? So the perception of empowerment is a barrier, but because of that perception, families are a little more reluctant to try to move forward in addressing either their needs or their child's needs. And so it's sort of a double barrier in that particular case. Families also, their experiences can lead to caregivers sometimes feeling suspicious and distrustful of the educational institution, of the educational system. Again, given the systemic and historical experiences that Black families and Latino families have gone through in US public schools in particular, this is justified in many ways, right? Like parents are hesitant. They're saying, wait, I saw what it was like for my brother to be tracked in schools, and I don't want that experience for him. I saw what it was like for my cousin to be in a self-contained classroom, and I don't want that experience for my child. And so there's a level of distrust with the educational system in the US that we really have to work to build. Honestly, we really have to work to build that rapport. And we'll talk about some of those strategies in the second webcast related to this. So how do we overcome these barriers, right? Like we've, again, kind of talked about all of these like dark things and like, this is not great, right? But how do we overcome these barriers? One of the ways that we can do that is through knowledge building. And there's a specific need to build knowledge among caregivers who have limited experience or knowledge related to typical child development or autism. And so because of that, they may experience less empowerment. And this lack of empowerment can impact caregivers' confidence in their ability, their willingness to advocate for services for autistic youth. And we found in some of the work that I've done, but also in other research, that Black parents, they identify parent education and training as one of the most important sort of tools for them. And they suggest that there's a need for more opportunities to be able to gain access to information about disabilities broadly, but particularly about intellectual disability and about autism. So Black families are really sort of yearning for that knowledge and yearning for that access to information. Hispanic immigrant families in particular who are raising autistic youth have been found to see autism as more of a temporary condition that would be cured through divine intervention. And so this is strongly tied to cultural and faith beliefs. And we talked at the beginning about that intersectionality, right? So this is where we see the role of intersecting identities and how it shapes our beliefs, our experiences, our knowledge, right? And so this creates an opportunity for knowledge building that is reciprocal. So the educator or the service provider who's working with the family has an opportunity to learn about the cultural foundation or the cultural influences that are shaping this family's perceptions and views on autism, but they also have an opportunity to help educate the family and share information with the family about the long-term outcomes and potential outcomes when raising an autistic youth, right? Like, what does that look like in terms of service access? And then, there was another study in a Somali community where caregivers reported having limited understanding of intellectual disability, and they reported a lack of education and awareness. So again, that need for knowledge building is prevalent among many communities. In the Hmong community, parents report difficulties understanding the educational system here in the United States. And there's a limited understanding of what special education even is and what is expected. So we see across various marginalized and international families, those who identify with historically marginalized racial and ethnic backgrounds, have experiences with needs for knowledge building. And a lot of times that comes with partnership. So through authentic dialogue and listening to Keisha's concerns, the IEP team learned that it was not accessing special ed services that was hard for her to accept, but rather the social stigma that was associated with autism in her community. The team connected her with an advocacy program in her community called FACES, where she could connect with families from similar backgrounds with shared experiences. And so FACES is a parent advocacy program that I facilitate here at North Carolina State University, and it stands for Fostering Advocacy, Communication, Empowerment, and Support. And given the experiences, given the disparities that we've been discussing for the past 40 minutes or so, there was a need to create a intervention or a program that is designed to enhance that knowledge, enhance that empowerment, strengthen advocacy practices, and help families, Black families in particular, build a sense of community to be able to address the needs of their children. And so on our next webcast, we're going to actually talk more about this, and we're going to go into more detail around FACES for educators. And so we'll talk about strategies for facilitating ongoing communication between families and educators. We're going to identify tools that educators can employ to support autistic youth and their families. And then we're going to help think about ways to develop a plan to reach historically marginalized autistic youth and their families in their community. So really meeting them where they are. Thank you so much for your time today. Feel free to contact me at jnpearso@ncsu.edu, or you can screen capture our website here, and it's also listed there on the screen. Thank you so much.